And hello, biology students. Good morning and welcome to today's lecture, really the beginning of the true biomolecule. So we've been talking about chemistry, got done talking about how water bonds with itself and how chemicals come together, but really, ultimately, all these chemicals come together to form this beautiful human body that we live in, and really any life whatsoever is based on these major molecules of life. And that is why when you read your food label, as I've had you done a couple times, this stuff's so important, why we think as a government, and almost every government in the world, society in the world, wants people to know what is in their food, because it is what makes you who you are. And so it's what allows us to survive. If you think back to humans 200 years ago when we didn't have grocery stores and refrigerators and everything to make food really simple, getting these kind of foods were really important to making us live. Or if you're a wild animal, really important to making you live. Today, we actually have issues with eating too much food because it's so available and so prevalent to many of us. Some of us still live in hunger, and that's really sad too. But we are capable of eating way too much because our bodies are designed to take in as much of this as we possibly can, because in the times we evolved as humans, you weren't always able to have all this food. So I think for your health, for your understanding of how life works, getting a good grasp of how biomolecules work in your body, also how digestion works in your body, can make you healthier. It can also save you a lot of money. I'll give you guys plenty of instances where I have friends buying crazy concoctions and crazy protein powders and everything else that they think are so good for them to make their hair grow longer and everything else. But if they just really understood their simple biology, they'd know that those people are just ripping them off. So hopefully you get some of that out of this in the next week or two. So the molecules of life, we've kind of gone over these already. A lot of today will be a little bit of review, but it's that important. I want you to hear it multiple times so you start to learn about these things. You hear about this first one we're going to talk about today, carbohydrates, all the time. So carbohydrates are your sugars and starches, as we'll get into, talked about all the time, because you got to reduce your carbs because you don't want to gain weight. And that's somewhat true and somewhat not true. So we'll get into why and how carbohydrates are super important for us, but how too many of them could be bad for us as well. Second one we'll talk about is lipids, which hopefully you remember as fat. We won't spend as much time on fats, but also super important. And you also find diets all the time saying, don't eat fat, fat's bad. But you know, you do need a little bit of fat. Although you can definitely live easier by living on carbohydrates than not any fats. So carbohydrates are slightly more important than fats, but fats are still pretty important. And the third one we'll talk about are proteins. We'll spend about a week on these because these are the most important of all the biomolecules. Well, they're all important, but proteins are what build us. They are the tools and the machines that make us. They are the parts that make us. And the last one, which we won't talk about till the end of the semester, is nucleic acids. This is your DNA and RNA. Obviously really, really important because it kind of tells the proteins what to do, and the proteins kind of control the carbs and lipids. So this is like the king of it all right here that runs the whole show inside any living being. But today we're going to focus on carbohydrates. Carbo stands for carbon. There's a reason I always bring up carbon all the time. And so it's carbon with a hydrate, which is water. So a carbohydrate is just, for every carbon, you basically have one water attached to it. And they are great for energy. And so hopefully if you can realize that carbon is C and hydrate is water, H2O, then the elements that make up carbohydrates are nothing more than carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And you can shorten that to CHO. So I always like to remember carbohydrates are CHO, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, fairly simple molecules, and totally loaded with energy. So anytime we got carbon attached to hydrogen, we got lots of energy. And this has, for every carbon, you have about 6 hydrogens, or every carbon is attached to at least 1 hydrogen, oftentimes 2 hydrogens. So that is pretty awesome and high energy. Okay. You at home right now, I want you to think of what are some carbs that you eat. And when I say carbs, I mean carbohydrates. Like, what are foods high in carbohydrates? I just had a donut for breakfast, very high in carbohydrates, also probably some fat. But Here's just a picture to give you an idea of different carbohydrates. So your candy, just loaded in carbohydrates, pure sugar, all carbohydrates. Potatoes, very, very high in carbohydrates. Rice, very high in carbohydrates. All your fruits are high in carbohydrates, and most of your nuts are high in carbohydrates. Although nuts, you might actually get a little bit of a fat in there as well, and there is slight amounts of protein in all of these foods as well, but mainly they are heavy sources of carbohydrates, which means they pack lots and lots of energy. And if you notice, all of our carbohydrates pretty much come from plants. And we'll talk about what kind of carbohydrates are in those in a little bit and why plants probably store all those carbohydrates. As we go through all these biomolecules, in your web quest, I had you guys always look up the monomers or building blocks of carbohydrates. Monomer means like the smallest unit, so chemical unit. Really important that we know these. And the building blocks of carbohydrates are something called monosaccharides. So right here, this monosaccharides, they are the building blocks of carbohydrates. Make sure you know that. When we talk about proteins, it'll be amino acids, and then lipids are fatty acids. Okay. Here is a diagram of how the chemical composition of a sugar looks. This is a monosaccharide. This would actually be glucose. And then it is the building block for other sugars like sucrose is right here, and you can see it's just two of those put together. And here is a polysaccharide, starch, and it's just four of those put together. So building block is a single saccharide, so we call it monosaccharide. So mono means one. Saccharide is a good name for sugar, okay? So saccharide means sugar, mono means one sugar, disaccharides we'll talk about two sugars, polysaccharide more than three sugars, okay? So that is our three types of carbohydrates. It's all gonna be based on size, and we have monosaccharides, like this should be review, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. Okay. Once again, that picture back again, monosaccharide, one sugar, disaccharide, two sugars, polysaccharide, four sugars. We're going to be doing a lab in class to test for all these sugars too. It's one of my favorites. So we're going to go through each one and give characteristics of them. And then after we go through that, we'll talk about what their uses are for. We're going to have a lot more on polysaccharides than any of the others because they're going to come back into play. But monosaccharides, as we talk about, it's just a single sugar. Examples, I'd like you to know this one especially, probably only this one if you can remember just one thing. Glucose is a monosaccharide. Glucose is for almost all life, at least any plant, animal, fungus. Glucose is our source of energy. It is what our cells use directly to create energy is glucose. We do still like fructose, but we actually turn fructose into glucose to use it as energy. So glucose is like the energy molecule of at least plants, animals, most bacteria, pretty much almost everything living uses glucose as energy. So it's super, super important. And so if you can remember any monosaccharide, it is glucose. And you can tell the difference between these two is very, very little, just hardly any difference at all between glucose and fructose. Really, it's just the position of one of its carbons is slightly different. So hopefully that helps. This is actually a hexagon where fructose is a pentagon, and it has a carbon here and a carbon up here instead. Would never ask you to know that, but we know monosaccharides. They taste sweet. Glucose, fructose, very sweet tasting. Fructose, right? And their formula is C6H12O6. All the monosaccharides have the same formula. They can be different in the way they arrange the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Anytime you see one of these lines drawn, anytime there's a dark line to a dark line, this, like where they meet, that's actually a carbon molecule. So that's a carbon, 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 carbon. That's an oxygen, that's carbon. So just so you see these a lot, that just gives you an idea. Each little branch, they don't write the C because we just know that a dark line is carbon. And really, really important, I want you to like highlight this, star it. Glucose equals blood sugar. So whenever you test for blood sugar, whenever you hear about blood sugars, you know, somebody's like, oh, your blood sugar must be low, or you have too much blood sugar, or diabetes, we're going to talk about that a lot. that is related to glucose, okay? So glucose is your blood sugar because, as I said before, glucose is the most important molecule when it comes to energy. It is the one every organism uses for energy, so it is the one we put in our blood to pump to our cells to give us energy. So glucose equals blood sugar. Keep that in mind. Disaccharides, I'm not going to care about them too much. They're just sugars that bond together. So in this case, you got two sugars bonding together, and this would be maybe maltose, or something called lactose, or sucrose is table sugar. And then here's lactose, milk. The sugar in milk is actually two sugars put together. Some of you may be lactose intolerant. We'll talk about that as well. And that means that you don't have the chemical to chop this thing in half. So in order for us to use this as energy, we'd have to chop this in half. And you require certain enzymes to do that. And some people don't create that enzyme anymore. So we can't break down this sugar. And then it means bacteria in our stomach get it, and it can make some of us feel not so well if we're growing those kind of bacteria in our stomachs. So lactose we'll talk about a lot being a disaccharide. And the one we're going to spend the most time on today is going to be polysaccharide. But I guess before we get there, disaccharides also taste sweet. I don't care if you know their formula, but basically it's two monosaccharides put together, but you actually take a water out. If you ever go further into chemistry or biology, we call that a dehydration thing. This is a long chain of sugar, so we had monosaccharide, two of them together is disaccharide. This would be a polysaccharide. This is cellulose right here. So polysaccharides are what we call complex sugars, or sometimes you hear them called complex carbohydrates. So when people talk about healthy foods, you might hear about complex carbohydrates, and that means we have really long chains of sugars, and they're not always as easy to break down, so it's a slower release of sugar into our bloodstream. And these are really good for storing energy because it's just a ton of sugars, and they're pretty easy to get apart quickly and turn back into glucose, so you can have energy very quickly. So organisms will store sugars in chains so that they can be stored for long periods. So polysaccharides, long chains of carbohydrate molecules, or long chains of monosaccharides. They are not sweet tasting, and they are not soluble in water. Okay, this not soluble in water is really important. Think back to a potato or a peanut, okay? So plants need to have energy for their little seeds to grow, right? So they have these little seeds, and they need to grow into a tall plant. Well, they don't get energy until they have leaves. So that seed needs to have stored energy for them. And so to store it as a starch or a polysaccharide is really good, because if it rains, the seed doesn't go away, right? If it was sugar, if it was a monosaccharide, as soon as it rained, it would dissolve in there and go away. Just like fruits rot really quick because they're mostly di and monosaccharides, they can get washed away quickly, easily rotted, easily used. Starches, they're not soluble in water. I think the spaghetti was able to cook in water for a long time, and it held its form. And if you think about it, spaghetti is just ground up seeds, ground up wheat. So starches, not soluble in water, is a really big deal for polysaccharides. Because polysaccharides are so different, we're going to talk about quite a few different types of them. These are just the basics. They get more complicated as life goes on. But we're going to distinguish between the ones in plants and then the ones in humans. There's also special ones for bacteria, special ones for fungus, but we're not going to worry about those. So in plants, plants store their energy in the form of starch. Okay, so starch is how plants store energy. Unless they use fat, they can use fat too. But starches, and here's some example of starchy foods. We have wheat, which is probably what was made to use that pasta. We have corn. I think some of you even heard of corn starch, so we grind it up and we get starch. And potatoes are just loaded with starch as well. And so these are all mostly seeds here. One is a root vegetable, but mostly seeds because they want to store energy for the plant to grow later. And then the root vegetable will also grow a new plant back in the spring from that vegetable, and it's also just storing energy for that process. Another type of polysaccharide in plants is cellulose. And cellulose provides structure to the plant. Remember, cellulose is what makes the plant cell walls. And so when you actually look at a tree, you're looking at cellulose. So wood is really cellulose and a protein called ligand, but cellulose gives it structure. This stuff we can't eat, or we can eat, but we can't digest it. So we can digest starch and turn it into sugar and use it. And even though cellulose is a bunch of sugar, we as humans are unable to use that as energy. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay. In animals, we store, you as a human, and this word is hard to say, but it's going to come back a lot, glycogen. So glycogen, make sure you write that down, star it as well. And it is the storage of sugars in animals. So plants store their sugars as starch. We store our sugar as glycogen, and we actually store it in our muscle and liver cells. And so we store that there for quick energy when, say, I haven't eaten for a long time. I forgot breakfast this morning. It's about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and I'm feeling kind of famished. I should have some stored glycogen in my muscles and liver cells, and my body can quickly turn that into glucose without hardly any work. It's just a real quick release of hormone, get glucose back in my blood, and I have energy again, even if I haven't eaten for a long time. So it's a good short-term storage solution for us to have energies. Fats are our long-term energy storage. So here's a picture of a liver. It is where most of our glycogen is stored for excess sugar when we need it. And this is actually a picture of inside. If we were to do a cross section and look at a very thin area of this liver, we can see all these different cells. And in here, there's big sacks full of glycogen, which is stored sugar for us to use in the future. And as I just said, when you are low on sugar, glycogen is broken back down to a monosaccharide and makes it so you have energy again real quick. So how your body burns each, so how these starches, these polysaccharides work in your body, I've kind of already talked about, but starch, this is just a reminder, it's the storage form in plants, provides us with lots of energy. So when we eat starch, we get tons of sugar. We're actually going to break it back into sugar. It starts immediately in your mouth. It's digested in your small intestine, gets into your blood, and then it can be either used for energy or stored as glycogen. If you get way too much of it, it actually can be stored as fat. So eating carbohydrates can make you fat because there's just so much energy in them. But ultimately, starch quickly turns into glucose, and then our body turns the glucose back into some other form of energy. Okay. Glycogen, we already talked about that. That's the storage. And it's when blood sugar is high, glycogen is stored in the liver and muscles for later use, okay? So glycogen is our storage. It's like the starch of animals. But starch is the storage for plants, glycogen storage for animals. Good news is we can use both of these for energy. Cellulose, as I talked about before, cellulose we cannot break down, so we can't use it for energy, but we actually do need it a lot. Number one, it's going to feed bacteria in your large intestine where your poop's made, and it turns out those bacteria are really, really important for us, and you need to give them food. So fiber is really, really important for us. So when you read a food label, fiber equals cellulose, and this is really good for us because it helps us poop. It's really good for our digestion. It's actually good for our mental health too. We'll talk about how bacteria are good for our mental health soon. A lot of interesting stuff, finding that the little microbes living in your large intestine actually can affect your mood and health quite a bit. So make sure you eat fiber, even though you don't get energy out of it. But cool, as a cow can totally eat cellulose. They have 4 stomachs and lots of cool bacteria that help them eat cellulose. So cows can eat grass all day long, which is high in cellulose, and live, where if I eat grass all day long, I will just die because I get no nutrients from it. That is all for our notes today, or part 1 of our notes. I'm going to have you guys do diabetes notes later, but I just wanted to make sure you wrote that all down. There'll be a short little quiz for you on that. And great having this lecture with you. Please, if you've had questions anytime through this, I am always on the Zoom call. If something is odd, you can pause the video right then, jump on Zoom, and ask Moriarty.